What if I told you that God's absence during your toughest seasons is actually part of His master plan? When my life hit rock bottom during the pandemic, I discovered this truth the hard way. Look at this verse from James chapter 1, verses 2 to 4. It completely flips our expectations of how God shows up during hard times. This scripture forms the foundation for what I'm sharing today. I'm breaking down how God actually reveals Himself in suffering, not through constant dramatic interventions, but through something far more powerful. This understanding transformed my shaky faith into something unshakable, and it might do the same for you. The truth behind God's apparent silence changed everything. Hey everyone, it's Damon. Have you ever prayed desperately for a miracle, only to feel like God ignored you? You're not alone. I've been there too. I remember sitting in my car one night, tears streaming down my face, begging God for a dramatic intervention in my marriage. I was convinced that if He really loved me, He would fix everything overnight. But instead, silence. At least that's what it felt like. For months, I kept expecting God to show up in spectacular ways, looking for burning bushes and dramatic signs. When my prayers weren't answered how I wanted, I felt abandoned, even betrayed. "Where are you, God?" became my daily cry. This pattern of expecting dramatic divine interventions creates a dangerous cycle. Each time our expectations go unmet, our faith takes a hit. We start to doubt God's goodness, His power, or even His existence. Have you noticed how we end up with weaker faith because we're searching for the wrong signs? Even the Bible's greatest miracle workers face this same disappointment. Before diving into Elijah's story, let's recognize the key lesson. Witnessing God's power doesn't make us immune to spiritual disappointment. Elijah called down fire from heaven, and then, just days later, sat under a tree, begging God to let him die. Right after his greatest spiritual victory, he crashed into depression when Jezebel threatened him. Psychologists studying religious coping mechanisms have discovered something important. People constantly looking for dramatic signs from God typically struggle more with anxiety and disappointment. It's like being on a spiritual treadmill, always running toward the next big miracle but never feeling satisfied. The real issue isn't God failing to perform miracles. The problem is our misunderstanding of what God's love actually looks like. We think love means rescue. But what if God's definition is different? What if instead of removing our problems, true love means walking with us through them to make us stronger? It took me years to realize this, but there was a perspective shift that changed everything. I was sitting in a coffee shop, emotionally exhausted, when I stumbled across James chapter 1, verses 2 to 4, in a way I'd never seen before. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. Let perseverance finish its work so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything. That coffee shop revelation completely changed how I viewed tough times, and it might just flip your perspective upside down too. Sitting there, hands wrapped around my warm mug, tears welling in my eyes, I suddenly saw it clearly. What if the strongest evidence of God's presence isn't Him rescuing you from the storm, but actually guiding you directly into it? Most of us have been searching for escape signs when God's been leaving growth markers all along. Romans chapter 5 puts it so clearly. Suffering actually produces perseverance. Perseverance builds character, and character creates hope. Like clay being pressed and molded under pressure, these words reveal how early Christians found profound meaning in their persecution. Can you imagine? The very thing we're praying to escape might be God's primary tool for transformation. This completely contradicts everything we naturally want. Comfort, quick fixes, pain-free paths. Think about it. Why would a loving God design a world where growth comes through pain? The divine curriculum throughout Scripture makes this pattern clear. Moses didn't just snap his fingers and lead Israel to freedom. He spent 40 years in preparation. Joseph's prison time was his leadership training ground before promotion. And remember Paul? He begged God 3 times to remove his thorn in the flesh, but God refused, saying, My grace is sufficient for you. Here's something fascinating. Psychological studies show that people who experience post-traumatic growth often report higher levels of life satisfaction and resilience compared to those who faced less adversity. This explains why some of the strongest believers you know have weathered the most brutal storms. They've experienced something that can't be gained any other way: the sustaining presence of God in the darkest valleys. Joyce Meyer's story perfectly illustrates this. During years of financial struggles, she learned to trust God in ways that would have been impossible without those difficulties. Now she looks back and sees how those exact trials prepared her for her ministry. What seemed like God's absence was actually His precise training program. When we grasp this principle, everything shifts. Those unanswered prayers, they're not evidence of God's neglect. They're signs of His intentional development plan. That relationship struggle or health challenge, it's God's classroom where He's developing something in you that couldn't be formed any other way. Look at 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 6 to 7, which tells us that trials test the genuineness of our faith, proving it more precious than gold. Gold becomes pure through fire. There's simply no other way. And your faith becomes genuine through testing. There's no shortcut to spiritual maturity. The real miracle isn't God removing your problems. The true supernatural wonder is facing impossible circumstances with inexplicable peace and otherworldly strength. Have you ever felt a sudden peace wash over you during your worst moments? That feeling that makes absolutely no sense given what you're going through? I used to dismiss those moments as weird emotional fluctuations, but what if they're actually something much more significant? God has been showing up in your life consistently, but you might be looking for lightning bolts while completely missing the gentle rain. Most of us scan the horizon for dramatic miracles while overlooking the quiet whispers, subtle provisions, and unexplained peace that are God's fingerprints all over our struggles. Let me show you 3 powerful examples of God's subtle presence. First, Joseph in that Egyptian prison. The Bible doesn't show God speaking through burning bushes there. Instead, God gave him favor with the prison warden and the ability to interpret dreams. These weren't flashy miracles. They were divine presence showing up in ways that led to his freedom and promotion. Can you imagine Joseph's confusion and pain, yet somehow finding strength to keep going? Second, remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in that fiery furnace? The king looked in and was shocked. "The fourth looks like a son of the gods," he said. God didn't prevent the fire. He joined them in it. God's fingerprint was the presence that walked alongside them when the heat was unbearable. Third, picture Jesus sleeping during that violent storm on Galilee. The disciples were freaking out while he was perfectly at peace. That story reveals something incredible. Divine presence brings unexplainable calm, even when everything around you is chaos. Research confirms what many have experienced. People who recognize God's subtle presence during hardships report significantly higher levels of peace compared to those waiting for dramatic signs. They've simply learned to spot God in places others miss. These subtle signs are often incredibly simple: an unexpected provision when you're at your lowest, a timely phone call with exactly the encouragement you needed, or strength to endure what should have broken you. Joyce Meyer says it beautifully. When we lean on God, we experience a special kind of rest and peace, even amidst challenges. That peace that makes no logical sense, given your circumstances, is one of the clearest signs of God's presence. God often speaks most clearly when we're at our lowest points, just like with Elijah under that broom tree, providing food, rest, and gentle guidance when he had completely given up. When you build your faith on God's faithful presence, rather than his miraculous intervention, your spiritual life becomes weatherproof. Your trust isn't tied to getting what you want, but to the certainty that whatever happens, you're never facing it alone. You know what I've learned through this entire journey? The real miracle isn't when God suddenly fixes everything around us. It's when he sculpts our inner landscape, transforming everything within us. As Joyce Meyer reminds us, when we trust God during our toughest moments, he works those challenges for our benefit, creating something beautiful through the very things that hurt. Research shows people with positive perspectives during hardships become more resilient, like everyday muscles that grow stronger only when facing resistance. This isn't just spiritual talk. Science confirms it. The next time life overwhelms you, instead of begging God to change your situation, ask yourself, what is He developing within me right now? This simple shift changes everything. When you look for God's handprints on your heart rather than His rescue footprints, you'll discover He's been there all along, not just working around you, but within you. That, my friends, is the greatest miracle of all. Stay blessed by the best.